Hello, everybody, and welcome back to What's Jay Reading, home of the old, the obscure, and the bizarre. I am, obviously, Jay, with a brand new selection of stories, so sit back and relax. In the early days of the 1990s, from the void left by the slow death of the main players of the comic industry the decade prior, a new figure arose to stand upon the stage and make their marks on the medium. A bright, shining label looking to merge the old with the new for a unified force in storytelling. And that company was Valiant Comics. Valiant's life was brief, only lasting roughly 5 years, but they certainly made a major mark on the industry during that time. The company's history, in short, begins at the end of the 1980s. Following his, how shall we say, controversial tenure as editor-in-chief at Marvel, industry veteran Jim Shooter made a bid to buy Marvel outright, partnering with a group of investors to take controlling interest in the company. This ended up not panning out, and the group were outbid by Ronald Perelman, and we all know how that turned out. So instead, the investors joined together to form what would eventually become Valiant Comics, getting the rights to a selection of characters from long-defunct Gold Key Comics and several commercial tie-ins to get their feet on the ground, before slowly building a universe of new and original characters around the old to make their mark on the industry. Shooter would leave shortly after they began, however, and Valiant's dominance would come to a close in 1994, when the company was bought out by video game publishers Acclaim, shuttering the entire universe and using the IPs to create a wide variety of video games based on them, and continuing comics for the most successful titles. Once again, we all know how this turned out. Our first title is one such series, one of the Valiant originals who made a breakout success during the era in both comics and games, and even beyond, with the series running even nowadays. We're on a trip down to the Deep South, with the original Valiant run of Shadowman. One of the first of Valiant's original heroes, Shadowman debuted in his self-titled series, cover dated May 1992, and was created by writer Steve Englehart and artist David Lapham, with creation assistance from Shooter, same as all of Valiant's originals. The series ran for 43 issues with a bonus issue 0 and 1 annual, or yearbooks as Valiant called them, with the final issue cover dated December of 1995. The Shadowman of the comics is a vast departure from what you might know from his video game counterpart, bearing some base similarities with the setting and concept, but otherwise being a completely different beast altogether. Our story focuses on Jack Bonifaci, a jazz musician who enlightens the heart and soul of the exotic streets of New Orleans, pouring his emotion into his work each and every day. But, after a chance encounter with a bloodthirsty monster that nearly claims him as their latest victim, Jack becomes supernaturally compelled to stalk the bleak nights of the city, pouring his emotions into a whole new line of work, as he dons the moniker of Shadowman, appointing himself protector of the city from all things that seek to disturb the balance of the spirits. It's heavily steeped in the mythology of voodoo culture, dealing with your standard rituals and dark magics, with a focus on the concept of the Loa, though it doesn't play as heavy a part as his later incarnations do. The threats Shadowman tends to deal with in this run are a blend of the mystical and the mundane, doing battle against your average muggers and drug dealers as much as he does evil shamans and mad spirits, sometimes both at once. It's an interesting combination and works surprisingly well. Jack is an interesting character, with his primary story arc dealing with the struggle of balancing his carefree, directionless life with the duties of Shadowman now forced upon him, and his attempts to do the right thing while being at the beck and call of the vengeful desires of his other side. He feels very out of time, more akin to a hero from the early Bronze Age than he does the 90s. Jack actually reminds me a lot of Moon Knight, both heroes being average men forced into a life of effective servitude to a supernatural entity, balancing the responsibilities hoisted upon them with maintaining their personal lives. And also because he's bug-fuck insane. Shadowman is treated as a split personality to Jack, manifesting when darkness falls upon him, and compelling him to go out to do battle against evil. The story heavily implies throughout that Jack is playing host to a Loa, using him as an avatar to enact its will, but never explicitly confirms it and leaving some ambiguity to his situation, at least within the initial 12 issues. The way the two halves combat each other is well done too, with both Jack and Shadowman vying for control, and in some cases even deliberately trying to bring the other out. The shift tends to not be super noticeable by design, blurring the line on which is in control, and again leaving the exact nature ambiguous, which I do like. It again feels more in line with something from an older era, with the split halves being played not for horror, but more for drama. The mask, a fairly iconic consistent between incarnations, is more symbolic here. While the two treated as Shadowman's face, so to speak, often refusing to fight directly without it, and the switch occurring almost on command when putting it on, barring a few instances, it has no actual power of its own, just being a Mardi Gras mask he finds lying on the side of the road. While this ties into voodoo culture, with the mask serving as a ward to keep the demons and specters of the nights from recognizing or harming someone, it's largely just a trinket here compared to the higher significance placed upon it in later versions. Not that it works as advertised either way, as Jack is absolutely dog shit at keeping his secret identity. While he might not be Daredevil levels incompetent at it, Shadowman has an unfortunate streak of exposing his true face to just about everyone he meets, good or bad. And sometimes they know he's Shadowman before he even meets them. The rest of his costume is, to put it mildly, absolutely stupid as all hell. This gaudy black-blue jumpsuit with a ridiculous bright white logo, vaguely resembling a figure standing in a doorway, screams the exact opposite of supernatural guardian of the night, and combined with his ponytail makes Shadowman look really embarrassing. Honestly, he looks leagues better when he's just wearing the mask and standard street clothes. I think the creative team knew this too, and in issue 12, alterations are made, throwing a black leather jacket on top and ditching the ponytail to make him a far more intimidating figure, a design which stuck with him into the rebooted Valiant universe. The biggest influence to Jack and his story arc comes from his involvement with Unity. I discussed Unity briefly before the last time I talked about Valiant comics, but as it's more relevant to both topics, I'll give it a bit more focus. Unity was an 18-issue crossover event released by Valiant during the early years of their shared universe, told across nearly every book out at the time, both new and old. The story of Unity focuses on Erica Pierce, a woman granted incredible reality warping abilities following a startling nuclear accident, the aftermath of which sends her hurtling through time and space. Driven mad in the process, Erica decides that the world is unjust and takes the matter of fixing it into her own hands. Declaring herself Mother God, she raises a massive army from across time and space, building a sprawling citadel in the space between time, and enacting a plan to completely obliterate reality as we know it, and reassemble it into her own ideal utopia. Valiant's star hero, Dr. Solar, rather takes exception to Mother God's scheme, largely because he's partially responsible for it to begin with, and he assembles a band of Earth's greatest heroes from far and wide to aid him in his battle against Mother God and save all of reality. Shadowman is not one of these heroes. Shadowman's invitation instead comes from a would-be geomancer, Mr. Endor, who implores Jack to follow the path to Unity as the whisperings of the Earth tell that he will be important. Jack obliges, even though he would really rather not to, and quickly finds himself in the midst of the war against Mother God. Jack's involvement with the greater picture of Unity is pretty minimal, at least in regards to his own book, but it has a major contribution to his own character arc. Jack spends most of the first issue pretty much clueless to what's going on and stumbling his way into Mother God's control room, entering during a heated duel between her and Dr. Solar, who's nearly got the win. Unfortunately, Shadowman picks the wrong horse to bet on, and helps Mother God get the win on Solar, imprisoning him and further prolonging Unity. From here, Jack spends most of his time just meandering about as a guest of Mother God, but after a chance encounter with Archer and Armstrong, realizes that things aren't exactly going the way he thought, and begins to try and rectify his mistakes in his traditional manner. Not that he makes any real impact, mind you, but the thought counts. No, instead what makes his appearance here matter is Jack's growing relationship with Elia, one of Mother God's troopers, as the two quickly fall madly in love with each other, forming a deep bond, keeping Jack remaining in Mother God's grace. This changes Jack greatly in two ways, especially following Unity. The first, naturally, being the loss of his great love, effectively erased from history and returned to her own place and time following the collapse of Mother God's scheme. This drives Jack mad with grief, serving as a significant motive for his continued battle as Shadowman, constantly praying and hoping that someday, somehow, his lost love will return to him in his own place and time. It's an interesting take on the long-lost lover story beat, and I really do enjoy the way it's handled. It's a good showing of Jack's own fragile mental state and the duality between him and Shadowman as his longing comes and goes, constantly thinking each and every person or victim he sees will be Elia. And it's also not overdone to an obsessive level where every single line he has becomes about his dead girlfriend, so it stays fresh. The second, and ultimately more important to Jack, change comes far more negatively. During his time in Unity, Elia inadvertently reveals parts of Jack's future to him, his later career as Shadowman, and eventually success as a musician, which keeps him motivated for sure. But most majorly is Elia accidentally revealing that in the original timeline, before Mother God would succeed, Jack is destined to meet a gruesome, untimely death in the not-too-distant future of 1999. With history remaining unchanged upon his return from Unity, Jack carries this burden with him throughout the remainder of the series, slowly driving him into a mad frenzy as he struggles to truly accept whether his fate is set in stone. I like this on two levels. The first, naturally, being that it's an unambiguous prediction. Jack is told in no uncertain terms what will happen to him, and with time presumably playing out as intended, he has no way to prevent what's coming to him until the day it happens. The other is the way Jack actually reacts to this, taking it as a sort of a get-out-of-death-free card and leading to Shadowman becoming a much more violent, more brutal fighter against his foes, treating his own life with reckless disdain since, after all, he knows when he's gonna die, everything will work out fine. It's a rare case where a pointless tie-in to a crossover story actually becomes a significant staying point with a comic character, and I'm genuinely glad it's kept up. Shadowman doesn't have much of a supporting cast. The only consistent non-villain is Nettie, Jack's housekeeper. She serves as his gateway to the supernatural, leading him into cases by dropping exposition about voodoo cultural concepts that tie into the thread of the week, or by introducing him to someone who does it for her. As well, she acts as his moral compass, frequently reminding Jack of his responsibility to be Shadowman and pulling him out of his pessimistic, self-centered nature, or criticizing him on perceived failings. She's an okay character, largely a stock archetype in her demeanor, and in some cases a bit stereotypical. The elderly Haitian housekeeper who of course knows all about voodoo and the supernatural and all that jazz, though I suppose with the setting being New Orleans, it's justifiable. Throughout the first 12 issues, Shadowman mostly fights your garden variety thugs, drug dealers, and gangsters, with only two recurring superpowered enemies he fights. The first is a man named Sosa, a redacted, who kidnaps children to redacted, and when he's done with them, he, rather literally, drains the life from them to fuel his own strength. While he's a despicable, irredeemable monster of a man, he's not exactly the brightest, first crossing paths with Shadowman in issue 3, largely because he's bored and thinks fighting him would be neat, and ironically inverted in issue 9 as our hero finds out he's back in action largely by coincidence. And despite his vampiric powers and vast criminal empire, he's hardly a threat to our hero, as Shadowman completely thrashes his ass with little effort on both occasions, and it's only due to the fact that he just won't fucking stay dead that he has a lasting impact. The other is Dark, spelled all fancy-like, a voodoo warlock first appearing in issue 7, scheming from the shadows, before taking a more active role in the preceding issues. Dark is a smooth-talking cult leader, luring in followers with promises of their heart's greatest desire. Wealth, fame, power, chicken sandwiches, anything and everything they crave he shall grant in exchange for their service. But Dark's gifts always come with a steep, fatal price, and he always comes to collect. This, in turn, fuels Dark's true goal, a ritualistic slaying of numerous souls over numerous days. With each and every life claimed, his power grows exponentially, albeit for short times, and completing the ritual will make him unstoppable. Naturally, this makes him an obstacle for Shadowman, focusing his sights on the warlock as he further destroys and corrupts the people of New Orleans, making things personal as Dark begins targeting those closest to Jack, and eventually him. He's a suitably creepy foe, with an unnaturally calm demeanor and subtly abnormal features, stalking Shadowman from afar and slowly bending the hero to his whims. Even from the start, he's more than a match for Shadowman, and brute force has no effect on the mad wizard. His corrupting nature is well highlighted by his attempts to woo Jack to his side by attempts of fame and fortune, which highlight the dichotomy between Jack and Shadowman, as Dark attempts to turn the two halves against each other. This I find to be really interesting for a villain, and is rather rare to so directly turn the man and Superman against each other, here more literally than usual. His end goal is fairly generic, amassing power for power's sake, but is handled well despite it. My only main issue is Dark feels a little overloaded at points theme-wise. He's a warlock, but also a cult leader, he's committing ritualistic murders and simultaneously making Faustian bargains with people, half of which aren't much necessary as his end goal only requires a specific amount of kills to reach. He's also like a drug kingpin or something on the side, and they set up near the end of his arc that he's some kind of immortal, or the living dead, or some other third thing, all of which would work fine on their own, but lumped together in one guy feels really bloated. There's also his sister, who's in the same boat as Dark, but opposes his plan by passively aiding Shadowman, but she gets very little development through the arc. Not that it's a gigantic waste or anything, but a lot of times she just tends to just be there. Shadowman's art is really solid, a multitude of different artists and colorists throughout that each add their own unique spin on the book, but provide a consistent visual look to the series. Like all of Valiant's titles, it aims for a more realistic approach to designs, heavily emphasizing consistency of characters and environment, with strict adherence to models, but still allowing fluidity in movement and action staging. However, as befitting the streets it calls home, the color palette is bright and vivid. Lively, saturated tones permeate throughout, and even the murky blackness of the night is dazzling in a wide array of colors. The overall quality of the pencil work and colors varies slightly from artist to artist, but even at its weakest still remains solid. Special shout out to issue 6, featuring artwork from the man of spiders himself, Steve Ditko, who blends the aesthetics of the book with his own styling near seamlessly, even if the coloring isn't up to par. While the original Shadowman may not have been well remembered as his predecessor, he still leaves a lasting mark on Valiant and a strong impression on the reader. The interesting blend of mundane crime with supernatural mischief is still relatively untapped, and it does so exceptionally well. If you're more into the video game, you may not enjoy it as much, but it's still worth checking out nonetheless. The rebooted Valiant universe brought back Shadowman, and that incarnation is something of an in-between of the two versions, so maybe start there if you aren't sure. And as was just recently announced, as I was making this video, there's gonna be a new Shadowman game coming out soon. Sort of an in-between, with gameplay and features based on the old game, but with the setting using the new Valiant version instead, which I'm really interested to see how it turns out. Now, before we move on to the next topic, I want to pull the curtain back a tiny bit. When it comes to selecting topics, I usually select them at random from a lengthy list I have of potential ideas, and when they have comparable themes, some more vague than others, I put them together into one video, and I usually don't actively seek out these connections. I preface this to say that it's a gigantic coincidence that I ended up not only talking about two different Valiant titles, but that both happen to be the most successful in the Acclaim era. We move on from the supernatural Shadowman to the legendary dinosaur hunter himself, Turok. Turok, Dinosaur Hunter, is arguably the biggest name out of the Valiant Acclaim titles, similar in status to Shadowman in many ways, but exceeding it in others. Much like Shadowman, Turok is best remembered for the Acclaim game the company produced, but unlike Shadowman, who saw success but only received the one game, Turok was massively popular and spawned a fruitful and long-running franchise of games over many years. A massive long-running franchise of exactly one good game. And 1.5. But beyond that, Turok himself has a legacy stretching far back, predating nearly all of his contemporaries at the time. Turok was first introduced in 1954, his first two appearances within Dell's anthology series 4-Color Comics, before debuting in his own self-titled series 2 years later. Created by an unknown artist, Turok's series followed a somewhat standard pulp adventure premise set up in the origin. The stories told the adventures of two pre-Columbian Native American hunters, the eponymous Turok and his sometimes brother, sometimes student Andar, in what would later become the southern United States. Initially identified as being from the Mandan people, later retconned to the Kiowa people, Turok and Andar's exploits began one day when, out hunting, they find themselves lost in a vast cave network, ultimately leading themselves into a mysterious lost valley forgotten by time, where dinosaurs still roam the earth and mankind never developed any real form of society. Now stuck, the two hunters find themselves living day to day, dealing with the oddities the mysterious land deals to them, from battling the lethal environment to conflict with the many denizens that lay within, all the while searching for a way back home. Now, I haven't read all of Turok's old run, only a small sampling from across it, but it's a pretty good series in its own right. It's a lot of mostly episodic pulp adventure type stories that cover similar themes, but never really seem to retread specific beats in particular. Turok's solo book ran for 127 issues, starting at number 3 and ending at 130. Initially published by Dell, then later by Gold Key, from 1956 until it was cancelled in 1982, in the last year of the company's life. Jump ahead to the 90s, and Jim Shooter secured the license to use Turok's IP, to serve as a foundation for the new Valiant universe. Because Jim Shooter is a fucking boomer, and he was the only one in the industry who even remembered Turok at that point. Turok made his Valiant debut in issue 12 of Magnus Robot Fighter, a fellow Gold Key IP, establishing him within the universe prior to the coming of Unity. Several details of Turok's story would be retconned with his inclusion, but would otherwise remain largely intact as prior shown. The two most notable being pushing the hero's origin date up to the early 1800s, after the establishment of America and all of the fun stuff the natives went through. As well, the mysterious valley is established as the Lost Land, a sort of cosmic dumping ground where those who fall through the cracks of time end up, where the linearity of time is meaningless and anyone from anywhere can enter and leave. The Lost Land would be the same place Mother God establishes her utopia as mentioned above, and Turok would play a small role in Unity, largely acting as Mother God's elite enforcer in exchange for protection of his allies. But after an encounter with Archer and Armstrong, as detailed in my review of that series, he would turn against her and help the heroes in their battle. Turok's solo series picks up following Unity, with the collapse of Mother God's grand scheme kicking everyone out of the Lost Land and back into real time. Unfortunately for Turok, he ends up separated from Andar and his allies, and finds himself deposited in present-day America. Thus begins Turok's story again, once more stuck in a land and time not his own, and with the barriers of the Lost Land broken, he must continue his one-man hunt against the ferocious dinosaurs that now roam the modern-day Earth, as well as those who wish to exploit and harm Turok and his allies. Luckily for Turok, technology has made the art of violence much more sophisticated in his absence. Like most of Valiant's titles, Turok had a revolving door of artists and writers, his debut arc penned by David Michelin and a crew of artists, and the bulk majority of the first chunk of issues by Timothy Truman. Now, before I go any further, I do feel the need to preface this. I'm a cartoon bird person on the internet, and not Native American, nor are the comic writers. I have about as much indigenous heritage as Elizabeth Warren, and therefore do not speak from any authority, and my knowledge of tribal culture, be it the Kiowa in general, extends to what bits and pieces I can find reading online. While both the Gold Key and Valiant comics appear to be fairly authentic in their depictions of their culture, I cannot claim for certainty that they are, and will largely avoid making any commentary about how they are depicted. For what it's worth, Truman has a lengthy history writing westerns and seems to understand them fairly well, and from what information I could find, it seems the Kiowa largely had positive receptions to the series, if that helps any. The opening arc largely deals with leftover plot threads from Unity, establishing Turok into the new setting, and a setup of the basic premise of the series. Getting dumped into late 80s Colombia, a time frame totally ignored when Truman takes over, Turok slowly begins trying to build a solid living for himself in the land, attempting to integrate himself with the people there, native or otherwise, as he stalks the dense jungles for his prey, the remnants of Mother God's cybernetically enhanced Dinosaur army, responsible for his separation from Andar, and their leader, the psychotic yet brilliant mastermind Monarch, no not that one, or that one either, as funny as it would be.
That's what I'm talking about! Now Venture will send Samson after the rest of us and he'll go totally sick house on our asses! I like my ass, gentlemen!
This also leads Turok to crossing paths with a local drug lord, whose operations are being disrupted by the Dinosaurs and would prefer they be dealt with. The opening arc is solid, but unremarkable. While it sets the tone for the series at large, very little of what it accomplishes plays any real part going forward. Turok adapts to the modern day fairly quickly, the people and new land he's in, and more importantly the weaponry, but he doesn't much interact with any other groups he comes across. The subplot about the drug lord and Turok teaming up feels tacked on and somewhat stereotypical based on the location. Same with the subplot about a scientist wanting to preserve a Dinosaur to repopulate the Earth with dinosaurs, because that idea never went bad before. But it gets to the heart of what we're all here for quickly and gleefully, killing some motherfucking dinosaurs with machine guns. It's wonderfully violent and action-packed, and really does carry the tone of the series overall. Beyond that arc, the series settles into its regular groove, with Turok trying to adapt to the ways of the modern day in the nightmarish shadow of US bureaucracy who politely request him to hunt the many dinosaurs wreaking havoc across the world, and those who would seek to exploit them. Turok's character has been fleshed out considerably from the Gold Key run, giving him some much-needed depth. While the old Turok tended to come off as the rather one-dimensional, noble Indian shaman hunter staking his claim on the wilds type you saw a lot in older westerns, he still retains much of that stoicism, but Truman works by diversifying his emotional range and motivations, transforming him to what is essentially the Native American version of a Doom guy. His experiences across the Lost Land and return to a world not his own have reshaped Turok, now a much more bitter and pessimistic man than before. In his many interactions with modern man, be it his own people or outsiders, you can feel his anger and sorrow in every action and every word. He retains his old ways of thinking, and this creates the primary conflicts for his character, dealing with ever-encroaching destruction of his freedom and way of life, be it the government treating him like their pet, or those who see him as a trophy or sideshow attraction. He's got some edge to him, but it's subdued, unlike the expectations of the era. He manages to adapt to some degree and find some things to enjoy, but still holds his ground with his goals and refuses to compromise on his own morals. Turok's supporting cast is relatively small, but they both make a big impact for their roles. First is Dr. Reagan Howell, a university researcher who's been assigned to document Turok and help him adjust to the modern day, while also trying to keep him from being exploited by the feds. She serves as a good foil for Turok, juxtaposing her rose-tinted view on the past and the way modern society treats history with his first-hand account, largely agreeing with him on most regards, but not quite understanding it the way he does. This puts her into a good middleman role, siding with him against the feds in attempts to exploit Turok, but having to reel him back from getting a bit too fierce. She does fall into something of a habit of getting captured by the arc's villain, though usually alongside someone else, so it isn't as lopsided as you'd expect. I also do like how they don't try to set her up as a romantic interest for Turok. Although there are a few teases of attraction, things are kept professional between them. Joining the two is Andy, Andar's grandson. When Turok and Andar's reunion proves to be ill-timed, our Valiant hero promises to take his former student's wayward youth under his wing just the same as Turok once did for him. Andy's a bit of a bad seed, to put it mildly. He considers himself a rebel, striking out against the man. Everyone else considers him a domestic terrorist. Andy is intended to be a mirror to Turok, showing him how his people have changed and culture forgotten in the years he has lost. A commentary on the conditions they deal with and the lack of a quality role model or moral guidance. I find him to be particularly insufferable, though. While I like the idea of a modern counterpart to Turok, he largely comes off as a cliche image of the extreme, edgy 90s bad boy that media seemed to think existed. In reality, he's very whiny, endlessly complaining, and rarely, if ever, contributes anything of lasting value. Now, obviously in a small segment, it doesn't show much time for growth, sure, but first impressions aren't great. Every 3 issues comprises a singular story arc, each focusing on Turok being sent after some variety of dinosaur causing havoc somewhere, fighting with the feds over the fate of the beasts, and inevitably crossing paths with a human seeking to exploit Turok or the dinosaurs. The first arc focuses on establishing Turok, his supporting cast, and the status quo for the series, as well as a twofold threat to face. Politely requested by the feds to take down a herd of allosaurs ripping through the Midwest, Turok and his team find themselves caught in a trap by Dr. Knoll, a demented billionaire with a private collection of endangered creatures, eyeing Turok as the crown jewel of his horde, as well as finding himself toe-to-toe with Knoll's hired help, the psychotic walking stereotype Long Hunter, a poacher for hire whose morals extend as far as the amount of zeros on his check. It's a solid opening arc. Truman quickly establishes the setting and formula he wants to use, and the main cast comes out fully formed. I like the way Truman depicts Turok coming to grasp with modern culture, analyzing him from an outward perspective in a way that shows him stoically shouldering the turmoil and burdens. It's relatively subtle and doesn't come off as preachy or the writer soapboxing his personal views on the topic. The series overall has that flavor of bittersweetness, with a leaning to bitter more so, best seen with Turok finally reuniting with Andar in the real world after all their journeys, Andar now an old man after their separation. Short-lived though it is, it's a really emotional moment, but Turok makes his peace and doesn't dwell on it for melodramatic moping like other characters of the era might. Noel and Longhunter are both rather flat villains, though it works more in Longhunter's favor. Noel's your bog-standard crazy billionaire who justifies his greed as altruistic, enslaving endangered species for his own personal private collection. There's very little in terms of personality to him. Beyond dealing with his twisted man-child son, Noel hardly stands out that much. While the archetype works as an antagonist for Turok, sort of a poster child for the ills of modern man, beyond his archetype there's little to say. Longhunter similarly has little to him beyond his base archetype, a jingoistic caricature of the ignoble sport hunter, more testosterone than man, and killing for the sake of it. Though unlike Noel, that archetype is inherently entertaining in the hands of a competent writer, someone who's just open about his contempt for everything that isn't him, and Longhunter is no exception to that rule. It's a joy to see his shit-eating grin just give zero fucks about anything beyond getting paid, which makes it all the more fitting when Turok hands him his ass like a total bitch. The second arc starts about the same. Turok and the gang are forced to partner with a so-called expert on Turok's people, when a group of campers mysteriously disappear, and signs of dinosaurs are found with them. But dinosaurs aren't the only threat, as the kidnappers are the Spider Clan, a tribe of warriors Turok once battled in the Lost Lands, whose psychotic leader Ch'Chak seeks revenge against our brave hero for siding with Mother God. Now, it's a race against time to put down the dinosaurs, stop the spiders, and rescue their captives before the local sheriff comes in to steamroll the lot of them. This one feels like a step down for me. While I enjoy the more pulpy action-adventure style, it leaves much to be impressed by. It repeats several beats from the previous arc, namely Turok versus Modern Man, in this case through the lens of the obnoxious and egotistical Professor Challenger, who's mostly just cartoonishly dickish to Turok until he actually starts seeing dinosaurs up close. Ch'Chak as an antagonist feels weak, too. They try and set him up as a sort of evil counterpart to Turok with the way he acts, but it largely falls flat and he just comes off as a bully. That and he's horribly outclassed since he's only got clubs and spears, while Turok has a fucking assault rifle. But I do like the stuff with Reagan getting a first-hand view of the spider's prehistoric lifestyle, wholly untouched by modern life, and the weak human antagonist is made up for with a whole shit ton of dinosaur hunting, with a nice wide variety of beasts our heroes face down. That, and the ending of the arc is such a downer, it hits you like a fucking truck. The third and final arc we're looking at, guest written by Mike Barron, takes a decidedly different approach to things. What starts as Turok taking a sabbatical from Modern Man out west turns into a frenzied battle for revenge against Chun-Li Fat, a Chinese drug lord who specializes in all-natural organic remedies poached from slaughtered exotic wildlife, who crosses the dinosaur hunter by attacking his gracious host's ranch to kill his prized buffalo. And as if things couldn't be worse for Turok, Fat has found himself in a partnership of sorts with one of Mother God's Bionosaurs, so even if he didn't start things, the man was already on Turok's shit list to begin with. It's certainly very different tonally than the previous two arcs, leaning closer to a cheesy Hong Kong action film than the pulp serials of prior. It's not bad though, it's a good change of pace and nice for a break from the previous arc. It touches on some of the same beats again as the first arc, namely the poaching/exploitation of wildlife and the life of natives through the lens of modern society, but it's done differently enough to avoid feeling copied. Fat is an entertaining villain, cartoonish and goofy to be sure, but again he works with the narrative. I've always liked this style of villain, a sort of modern take on the classic stereotypical fiendish oriental alchemist/wizard you saw a lot back in the Golden Age, toned down just enough to not get anyone in trouble. His henchmen are rather boring though, and him partnering with a Bionosaur has very little significance in any way, largely only existing to justify Turok being here. The shift to grimy inner-city LA is a nice change of pace from prior, and I like the parts where Turok adjusts the big city on his hunt, the first true test of his spirit against the horrors of modern man. Barron definitely goes for a more overtly comedic style, lots of quick gags and quips, which doesn't much work for the series, but isn't obnoxious or funny on its own. He doesn't have the best grasp character-wise though, as his Turok is noticeably different in demeanor throughout. leaning more towards the stereotypical expectations of a Native American fighter, and creating a few mini plot holes to boot, and overall I just much prefer Truman's version better. Baron seems more interested in set pieces and actions than characters, because boy howdy there are a fuckload of fight scenes in this. And to his credit, they're all great. Frantic and fast-paced with very little filler, giving Turok plenty of space to do what he does best, even if his first fight with the Dinosaur is lacking to some degree. Turok's run with Valiant has a rock-solid opening set of issues, and it's hard not to see why it brought him back into the limelight for so long. A great blend of tones and narrative beats with a strong balancing of them all, nothing becoming too drowned out by another, and even weaker aspects of a story are balanced by others. The art is about on par with other Valiant titles, copying the same general aesthetics with both the pencil work and colors, though sharing many of the same gripes as well. It's no wonder the run is as fondly remembered as it is, and I would highly recommend checking it out, especially if you're a fan of the game series. That'll be it for this time. As always, I hope you've enjoyed, and I'll be back again sometime soon. As for now, remember this: if the majority are saying something, then peer pressure is probably real.